Back with a Fox News alert this morning. 8 people were stabbed in a mall in St. Cloud, Minnesota last night by a man shouting Allah as he asked his victims if they were Muslim.
Fox News contributor and U.S. Army vet Pete Hegseth was in St. Cloud just yesterday. He joins us live now from Minneapolis. Good to see you, Pete. Certainly not under these circumstances when you see what is clearly a terror attack on the ground in Minnesota. What are you hearing there? What are people saying?
Yeah, I mean, I was there for a football game later on that evening. There was this attack. Listen, what's happening in Minnesota is a microcosm of the refugee concerns in America. There's large swaths of Somali Muslims have come to Minnesota over the last number of decades. There's no real understanding of how many. Many have resettled throughout Minnesota, Rochester, Minneapolis, and St. Cloud. A significant population, upward of 10 or 15% of the population in St. Cloud now. A lot of tensions, and there has not been the amount of assimilation a lot of Minnesotans have wanted. So there's a concern that this population could do something just like this. The FBI director a couple of months ago said that literally about the Somali population in Minnesota, there is a terror recruitment problem, and that community is in denial. And a lot of Minnesotans, I can speak for folks here, there's been this abiding concern that something like this might happen eventually. Unfortunately, it did in St. Cloud, it appears, although we don't know the identity exactly of the attacker. And with the places like the Mall of America and others here in Minnesota, those fears continue.
So that refugee resettlement didn't happen accidentally. It was federal policy.
That's right.
And the upshot has been to turn your state from a peaceful state famous for its niceness into a place where there are more terror plots foiled than any other state in the union. What was the point of this? The U.S. government is supposed to act on behalf of the country. What was the point of this resettlement?
The point of this was open arms no matter what. It was open borders. It was the view of the world that the left has. Lutheran Social Services here, one of the resettlement groups, is just committed to bringing as many as possible with open arms. I mean, Minnesota is a welcoming place and always has been. But if you're not going to assimilate and become a fabric of the state, that's when people start to have very real concerns. And no state has sent more people to go fight with al-Shabaab and ISIS than the state of Minnesota. And so it's about time we stand up and start asking questions. Hey, we need these folks to assimilate. We need to make sure there's allegiance. We've got to track these radical mosques. We've got to have maybe a pause on this program. And yet our leadership here in Minnesota, Governor Mark Dayton, tells everyone who has a concern that, well, you're just un-Minnesotan, then you can leave the state. The reality is we just want to make sure that anyone comes here is a part of that fabric. And we don't know how much it costs, we don't know how many, and we certainly can't track allegiance at this point.
Right, you don't have to look any further than Europe to look at their immigration laws and what they have dealt with over the past even 12 months there because of their lax immigration laws. And you see that creeping into this country now. What can we do about it? What do we do so we feel safe? So in a place like Minnesota, as Tucker was saying, this lovely place that most people normally feel safe there, aren't on edge.
Get our hands around refugee resettlement programs. Minnesota literally has no idea how many Somali Muslims are here because you have secondary migration, and then there's not a lot of tracking of where they live necessarily. So when Donald Trump talks about extreme vetting, when Donald Trump says we want to know who's coming into our country, he is on to the pulse of many Americans and Minnesotans that say, hey, they're not sending refugees to the gated communities of the elites. They're not sending refugees to Washington, D.C. They're not sending them to Summit Avenue in St. Paul. They're sending them to rural communities and elsewhere where they're left to deal with it. And the citizens are saying, hey, this isn't going very well. And another problem here in Minnesota, big welfare magnet, and so you get a lot of folks coming here because of the generous benefits. You've got to look at the refugee resettlement.
Was there ever a vote on this? It's supposed to be a democracy. Did you, as a Minnesota resident, ever have a chance to weigh in? Was the population ever consulted about this, ever?
Of course not, never. And no real sense of who's coming and how many. And so you've got city councils and others overwhelmed, and that's where you get a lot of consternation. Again, it's elites telling us this is something we need to have. And then the folks on the ground saying, wait, it's time to hit pause. Donald Trump is right. Let's hit pause and figure out who's coming here because they're committing terrorist acts.
Yeah, there seems to be a real disconnect there.
That's what suicide looks like.
Pete Hegseth, live for us, Minnesota. Pete, good to see you this morning. Thanks for being here.